Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's online assembly being hosted jointly by the UK Major Ports Group and the Open Data Institute Leeds. Now, if you'll just bear with us for a moment or two, we're admitting people to the call, but we'll get started as soon as we can because I'm certainly very conscious it's getting towards the end of the day. And I imagine that for the unfortunate amongst you, some of you will have some extra work to do. The more fortunate of you, hopefully, will all be contemplating some kind of cocktail hour. And some of us, myself included, will have to make the kids tea. So we'll be looking to finish at a reasonable time. And also, if you could bear with us, because as you can probably imagine in these circumstances, there's a number of different people in a number of different locations all dialing in to do this together. So my name is Tim Morris, and I run something called the UK Major Ports Group. I'll be one of the speakers tonight alongside some of the far more knowledgeable and experienced friends from the Open Data Institute in Leeds. The UK Major Ports Group is a trade association for 9 of the 10 largest port operators in the UK. Our members operate 40 ports all around the coast of the UK, including the largest ports in England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Between them, they handle about 3/4 of the UK's port traffic. Now, that might seem a little bit of a sort of a stat for you, but it's actually something of a big deal. About 95% of everything that enters and leaves the UK, all the stuff, all the goods, including, for example, over half of the food and feed needs of the UK, and indeed almost every screen that you're looking at right now does so via ship and therefore via our ports. So we are, as an island nation, very much dependent on the sea, which is somewhat ironic given some of the things that we're going to learn about and talk about coming up. So the plan for this evening is that after some welcome words from me and my boss, we'll hand over to Tom Forth, who's head of data for the Open Data Institute Leeds, who will take us through their work that they've been doing to gather and harness big data sets for this project. After Tom's lifted the lid on the data magic, Tom and I will pick up a couple of the points that have struck us from the work that they've been doing so far. Then we'll be throwing open the conversation to all of you as well. Paul Connell, who runs the Open Data Institute Leeds, will chair an online Q&A for you to put some questions to Tom and I, but also, and I think this is really important for you, to highlight anything that's particularly struck you about what you've seen so far and what it means. So I'd encourage you, as Tom and I run through the questions, to think about what you want to ask, what you want to raise, and we'll try and make the second half as much of a discussion as we can, given the digital circumstances. So you should see a text box on the right-hand side of your screen right now, where you can type in questions and comments. There's also the option at the bottom of the page to use a virtual post-it note, but that is far too clever for me to explain what there is. So have a play around with that as well. What I wanted to do was to stress that tonight's session is very much a stepping stone on an ongoing conversation. The data tool that Tom's going to be showing us is open in many senses. The data it uses is open, but the tool itself is open, and that's open for everybody's benefit, for you all to use if you wish, outside of this session. And we, and by that I mean Tom and especially his very capable colleagues, would be very interested to hear from you about how it can be developed and improved as well. That's both in terms of the data that goes into it, but also how it works and what it produces as an outcome. But the data and the tools themselves are the means, not the end that we're heading towards. While the data unquestionably shows that there are some very significant levels of socioeconomic challenges facing coastal communities all around the UK. So the real goal of this project is to add to the momentum about what we, and that's a pretty broad set of we, could and should be doing in addressing these challenges. I guess at this point you could probably reasonably ask, why are ports interested in this? After all, we are not charities, and nor are we philanthropic institutions. It's a good job I didn't say that after I'd been cocktail hour. It's partly because these communities are the ones in which we operate, and in many cases in which we live, and in lots of cases have done so for centuries. But it's also because, in many cases, what makes these communities thrive and succeed also makes businesses thrive and succeed. Good jobs, local prosperity, investment, transport, energy and data connections, skills and talented people. That's what communities need. That's what businesses to be successful in them need as well. Major ports are big contributors to these factors in communities today where they're based, but we want to do more, and we know we should be doing more. And we want to do this by growing and succeeding alongside our communities. So with that, I'll hand over to my boss, Charles Hammond. Charles is both the chair of the UK Major Ports Group, but also the chief executive of one of the UK's largest port operators, Forth Ports. So run VT, cue Charles.
Hello everybody, and welcome to this UK Major Ports Group digital online assembly. The UK's major ports are part of an essential industry, the ports industry in the UK, and we represent all the major ports in the United Kingdom. We invest hundreds of millions of pounds per annum in new modern facilities to facilitate trade, because trade is one of the great enablers of prosperity in our country. Now, one of the major policies which we are promoting just now is the fact that many of the communities in which the major ports operate experience some of the lowest levels of poverty and deprivation anywhere in the UK. So we want our investment, we want trade to level up these communities, create jobs and prosperity, and make sure our coastal communities are not left behind. Now, one of the many things the UK major ports are rich in is data, as well as investment, as well as skills. And we want to use that data to create and reinforce that prosperity in the communities in which we operate. So I hope you will enjoy the assembly. I hope you will benefit from the tools which are on offer, and I hope you will have many good ideas that will help us create that prosperity in data and digital innovation for the future in our industry. Thank you very much.
And with that, thank you to Charles. I find myself in a slightly weird position that people must do in these awards ceremonies when they're thanking people who are on films. But after those words of introduction, now on to the magic. And I'm going to hand to Tom Forth, Head of Data at the Open Data Institute Leeds, who's going to take us through some of the magic that him and his team have been performing to harness big data sets and produce some really interesting outcomes about what they are and what they could possibly say. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Tim. From Forth Ports to Tom Forth. The joke has already been made in the chat. So I wanted to start off by reminding everyone of something pretty pointless if they're watching live, but people will watch this afterwards, not live. Everything that we've done is on the web for this project. So if you go to odileeds.org/project/coastal economies, or you search for ODI Leeds Coastal Economies, you will see everything that we've done. And that's one of the best ways to keep in touch with us, to make suggestions, to see how things are getting on, because things are improving all the time in this. So the place I wanted to start is a bit of a strange place in the work that we've done, because I want to start with someone else's work. It's actually an organisation that's helped us throughout the project. So we said we were working with the UK Major Ports Group. The Office for National Statistics got in touch and said, hey, that's interesting because we're working on coasts as well. And their work was released in October of this year, and they looked at coastal towns in England and Wales. And it's a lovely bit of work that looks at all kinds of things around educational achievement, unemployment, deprivation. And it looks at it for just the coastal towns of England and Wales. You can read it and you can see what's going on. And if you zoom out on their map of where they look at, you'll see that it's basically an empty map. And that kind of left us with the question, can we look at more than just coastal towns? We want to look at the whole of the coast. We want to look at the cities, which is actually where most of the people who live on the coast live. And we also want to look at more than just England and Wales. We want to look at not only the whole of the UK, but possibly also our close neighbours, because our coastal economy relies on our neighbours as much as it does on ourselves. Boats typically go from a port to another one. And that's one way of looking at the coast. And we have a lot of interdependence on our coast. We have shared coasts as well within the UK and with our neighbours. So the first problem that we had was to discuss what is a coast. The first part of this presentation will talk a lot about the island of Ireland. It's great because it's a nice shape to put on slides. It's quite square. It's reasonably easy to work with, but sufficiently difficult that you can fix most of your problems. So when we were developing all of the products that I'm going to show you, we worked a lot with Ireland. And what I've done there, got there for you, is a drawing of the coast of Ireland. We did a lot of work to decide that 10 kilometres was a reasonable distance from the coast to define somewhere as coastal. We're only looking at the land, but of course the coast kind of goes out into the sea as well. And we developed quite a lot of data and code, which is all shared online on GitHub. Again, if you go to the project page that I shared right at the start at ODI Leeds, you can see all of that code and copy it for your own projects, use it for what you want to do. And the reason why we wanted to formally in code define what a coastal area was because we wanted to get data and project it onto this coastal areas map. And this kind of shows what I mean by that. So at the top left is what you've seen, the coastal areas of the island of Ireland. If we wanted to change 10 kilometres to 5 kilometres, that is really simple. It takes 10 seconds in our code and you can change it. If you want to make it 20 kilometres, you can change it. That's one of the advantages of doing everything that we've done in code, that it all kind of compiles from raw and gives you new results every time. At the top right are the two different geographies of the island of Ireland, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and the smallest geographies for which we have data in both of those nations. So what we want to do is combine the two concepts. So at the top left, where is coastal? And at the top right, where are the areas for which we have data about Northern Ireland and Ireland? And when we combine that, that's what you get in the middle at the bottom. You get a map of just the coastal areas of the island of Ireland. One of the reasons why I mentioned that Ireland was a nice island to work with was that it contains most of the difficulties that you'll find working for the whole of Europe. A particular difficult one is that there are parts of Northern Ireland which are coastal, but which are not on the coast. And they are not on the coast of Northern Ireland. So they are coastal only because of their proximity to the Republic of Ireland's coast. And we see that quite a lot in coastal areas across Europe. Antwerp, one of the largest ports in Europe, is not on the Belgian coast. It is a Belgian city, but it is on the Dutch coast, which is no doubt something that causes difficulties at times for people. So this is the first kind of problem that we solved. And we've written all the code that does that, and we've shared it, and you can play with it. The second one was to start thinking about the coast as a line. So this is the island of Ireland again, with some of its major towns and cities shown. And on the left is a high resolution coastline. And on the right is a much more simplified coastline. And we developed this technique so that we could display analysis of the coast in a more accessible way, but also to display it on the web, because some of the images that I'll show you are enormous. There'll be many gigabytes. You're not going to be able to see them on the web. You're not going to be able to interact with them easily. Once we've simplified the coast down, it's really small, can be just a few kilobytes. It will load instantly on any device. And once we'd simplified the coast down to a line, we decided that we would figure out how to project data onto that coast. So what I have in the middle of this image is the income of each of the small areas of geography. So in Northern Ireland, they're super output areas, and the Republic of Ireland, they're electoral districts, but it doesn't matter. You get one view of the whole of the coast because we've joined the two together. We have in the green and blue colours areas with a high income. So those are places like Belfast, Dublin, Cork, Galway. And we have areas with a low income. Those are the more rural and remote parts in the northwest of Ireland. So in this way, we can take the geographies, which are in the middle, but we can project that data onto the lines of the coast themselves, which is what we see on the furthest right. To show you a little bit more clearly what we've done there, we'll just look at Northern Ireland now. And this was a very early prototype that I did. I did this in Excel and Illustrator. But this is an example of income along the coast of Northern Ireland from Derry to Newry. And you can take that line, which we see, the highest income is in Belfast, the lowest income is towards Newry, but also at the Giant's Causeway up at the north. And you could stretch that out into a straight line and then have a bar chart of it, which is what's on the right. And that lets us start to do quite advanced analysis. So once we made this all into code, it looks more like this. So that's the whole of the island of Ireland with income. The more yellow it is, the higher the income is. The darker purple it is, the lower the income is. And on the right, I've shown that same graph that I mocked up a few months ago, but now automatically. At this point, I will try and show you the exact website where this is on. So let's try that. And I think that I now go back to share. And I will show you the web page that it's all on. So hopefully you can see this. Remember, it's all off this web page, but when you go onto it, you can see an interactive version of exactly what I've shown you here. So here are all of the segments of the coast of the island of Ireland and the income along them. We might choose to look at them in this way, and we can press this button and flatten everything out to one line. So what we can see here is that we have Cork, which is a very high income city, and we have Dublin, we have Belfast in the middle, we have the area to the west and north of Derry, which are quite low income parts of the island of Ireland. And also what we see here in Ireland, which is quite unique in some ways to Ireland, is that wherever there is a city, whether it's Sligo, Galway, Limerick, you see higher income areas. But we can look at this for anywhere we like. So England, Scotland and Wales, we might want to do that. We join the countries and the coasts together just based on what island they're on, because coasts don't really make sense detached from an island. So the same happens here. We can see whether it's Scotland from Dover on one end to Brighton, we kind of chop England at Hastings about. Sorry, Hastings. But everywhere else is somewhere in between it. And what we'll see is kind of what we know. This is the northeast of England here, which is quite low income, up to the northeast of Scotland, Aberdeen, Inverness, which is a very high income, largely due to the activity of ports and the oil industry. And then we have other areas, Liverpool, Blackpool here, all the way around. Bristol is quite prosperous. So we have this for income. We've also done work on house prices. We can only do house price data for England and Wales at the moment, but that shows you there on the map what's there. And we've also done population density, which I think is quite interesting. Let's look at France and Belgium. We decided to do France and Belgium as part of this project because they had good data. And if people contribute more data, then we'll add them to this work. So we didn't have Belgium data at the start of this project. Someone in Belgium, Martin, said, I can get you Belgian data. I said, great, we'll put that in. And that will be the same. And what we see here, which I think is quite important, is that we start in France at Nice, so right at the bottom, southeast. What we see here is a graph of population density. So the bars are how many people there are. we see that coastal living in most places is concentrated on towns and cities. And this is, I think, quite an important thing to be aware of. We will see the same in England, Scotland and Wales. So this area, this is the Highlands of Scotland here, has almost no population density. Whereas Southend is a very high population density place. Dover is high population density. This is Newcastle, I think. So that's all that I'll share of the live tool, but please do have a play with it. It's all online for you to have a go with. So I will now switch back to this one. And there we go. So all of the stuff that I've shown you there is data that uses open data as an input, is processed by open source code, which we share on GitHub, visualized using an open source library that, again, we share for anyone to contribute to and reuse for their purposes, and creates analysis and visualizations that you can use. We have 3 types of input data that we've proven it can work with. Very small area data, so that's income data. Point data, the house prices data, is every single home that's ever been sold in England and Wales, aggregated by whether it's close to the coast or not. And we have a third one, which is modeled or calculated data. That's for the population. And we also have a data set for accessibility, how many people can reach, how many jobs from each part of the coast. We've got the population data there. But we could have much more small area data using the techniques that we've developed. So we could be looking at unemployment, skill levels, deprivation, age profile, whatever we like, as long as we have data. And this is where, you know, we're kind of asking for some help in a way. We've created a data set for income that works across all of the 7 nations that we've looked at here. We've created a data set for population that works across all of the 7 nations. We've got house price data for just 2 places, England and Wales. We could have every data set for all of the map if we knew where it was. And that would be fantastic for people to come in and join in and say, this is how you would get educational achievement data that was reasonably consistent for Northern Ireland, Scotland, England, Wales. Fantastic. So if anybody's got that who's watching in, do please put it in the open document and we will get on it. So just to finish off my bit, I thought I'd give you some findings. I've shown you the tool. I've shown you what the data we use lets us do. I've shared the open source code that lets us do it and the tools that we've built. And also, you know how to contribute if you want to contribute to helping us expand this to other types of data. We'll be doing some of that anyway, but the more help we get, the faster we will move. Like I say, it's Martin Lambrechts just gave us all the data for Belgium and said, you might as well have Belgium. I said, great, thanks. Belgium was done. These are the first findings. So I think the first thing that struck me with the ONS's work was it just looked at coastal towns. And the coastal population is cities too. In fact, some people might say it's cities mostly. So Tim's background, which you saw earlier, is Belfast. So we wouldn't consider that a coastal town. It's Belfast, a city. I think we should probably be considering, when we think of the coast, both towns, cities, and rural areas. And I suppose Scotland would be the most extreme example of this, which is why I've picked it, is that if you look at Greenock, which is just near Glasgow on the left, and you look at Edinburgh, which is on the right, then it is the cities of Scotland which are on the coast, Aberdeen and Inverness obviously as well, Dundee too. So cities are where the action is on the coast, that's where the people are. It's important to consider them and not just towns. In Ireland, it's very much the same. So we look at where people live on the coast, on the island of Ireland. It's Dublin and Belfast, basically. You know, Cork, Waterford, Derry, the rest. But it's the big cities, and if we don't look at them, we miss something important. I know that we always get at least 20 more viewers if we talk about house prices. And the reason that we talk about house prices in England and Wales is because the data from the Land Registry is so fantastic. What's great about this data is that when the Land Registry released the pinpoint location of every house sale ever in England and Wales since 1995, they did not ever think that this would let us analyze coastal house prices. They didn't have a plan to do that. They simply released the data, and now we can look at it. I think one of the interesting things we see in this is that coastal house prices largely reflect inland house prices within England and Wales. That's the kind of main thing we see. The people of England and Wales are not clamoring to live on the coast, with the exception of the southwest, and that's something that I think will definitely anyone watching from the area from Bristol southwest all the way to Penzance will be saying, well, there are a lot of people who want to live here. That is definitely something different we see, but basically we see that living on the coast is not a huge premium for where people either want to live, whether they have high incomes or where house prices are high. This is a kind of like the very big map. This is a map which is about 3 gigabytes if you want the whole picture. That is as far as we can achieve a single view of where incomes are high and low in the 7 nations that we are working with. And there's a big version of that to download if you want. So we had to create this in order to look at the coasts, and we might as well share it as part of that. There's some findings that come out of that which are somewhat interesting. So the first one that I think is interesting is if we look at the ports, the cities and towns with big ports, especially cargo ports, I think that people do quite want to live near fishing ports if they're small and look nice and have small boats and you can buy a lobster on your holiday. I think that for these big cargo ports, we see a common factor in all of them. So on the furthest left, we've got Hull and Middlesbrough, so Teesport there, but we've got Immingham as well. You can even see, if you know where Immingham is on the map just below Hull, then you can spot it as a red place on there. So what people are doing in that map is they're saying the ports are very important for prosperity and jobs and growth, but I'm going to choose to live 10 miles away somewhere that's a bit away from the port. And in England, we see that means slightly inland, typically. So the second from the left shows exactly the same in the south coast of France. So that's Marseille in the red, and Toulon, which is in the orange. And again, there's a huge amount of the economy which is dependent on those ports, but people are choosing to live inland, or I think more commonly in France, in the next part of the coast. On the right-hand side, we see exactly the same pattern for Portsmouth, Southampton, Dover, Calais. Again, these places are not particularly high-income cities and towns, but they're clearly generating something of great value, and people are choosing to live close to them. In Calais, it's just to the west of it. In Dover, it's slightly inland in Kent. But we see the same pattern around pretty much every port city and town that we've looked at. Another thing that's quite interesting to me is that in France, people choose to live in cities and on the coast. So people who have enough money are living on the French coast, and it is the inland areas. In this case, we're looking at Brittany. It's the inland areas in those red colours. The red colour is showing that the income is low in those areas, and the green colours are showing that the income is high. And we see this property of France pretty much everywhere, that people choose to live on the coast if they have a higher income. And we see something very different in England, which is somewhat surprising in a way. So even in the southeast, where incomes are generally higher, we do see that a huge amount of the low income areas of the southeast of England are on the coast, preferentially. They seem to be there. So it's Hastings, Dover, Margate, Southend, all the way up to Ipswich and Felixstowe and places like that. And on the right-hand side, in the north of England, which overall has lower incomes, we see that people again aren't choosing to live on the coast if they have a high income. They're choosing to live in inland areas, whether it's North Yorkshire, the Peak District, just west of Sheffield, Cheshire, but they're not choosing to have a nice seaside property as much as would happen in France. And also the cities are not a place where people are gravitating to if they have high incomes. They may work there, but they're not choosing to live there typically. And there's loads of ways we can analyze this data. This is one way. It's all written up on our blog and on our website to see that if we just split England and France into the parts of the country that are coastal, are they poor? That means they're an income quintile of 1 or 2. In England, there's more of the coastal areas are poor. And in France, we see the opposite, that more of the coastal areas are rich. That means they're over to 4 and 5 on the income distribution. So the English with high wages avoid the coast. French with high wages choose the coast. It's quite an obvious difference. And Scotland is a bit more like France, and Ireland also is a bit more like France. In both cases, it's a little bit hard to be sure what's going on because so many of the successful cities in both countries are on the coast. So in Ireland and Scotland, most of the successful cities are coastal, whereas in England and in France, many of the successful cities are inland. So the last thing that I'll show you on this was I picked out the areas with the highest and lowest income on the coast, which we can do. We could look at house prices, we could look at population density, we could do whatever we want. I picked these out really because I thought that some of the low income places would be fantastic to live, really. I've always fancied living in Marseille. But these are the answers. I had a lovely time in the north of Northern Ireland. It's one of the lowest income coastal areas in the UK, but it's very nice. These are just a map of where there is high incomes and low incomes, Aberdeen and Brighton for England and Scotland, your high points of high income places to live if you want to live on the coast. You probably won't be able to afford a house there though, so it's a trade-off. So that's all from me. A reminder that the link that we've shared and to the website has everything that I've talked about and much more. Play around with the tool, have a look at the code, suggest things that you want adding to. And this is just a summary. I will pass back to Tim, and then we will have some questions.
Thanks, Tom. I mean, I could ask a whole bunch of questions myself right there, but I think I've had a sort of day to look at some of this data and some of the outputs, and what struck me as well as what Tom's put on the slide there. There's probably 3 different categories of things that have struck me as we've looked at this. The first one is that actually, taking the coast as a whole. When we say the coast, as you'll have seen from some of the graphics, what we also mean are some of the estuary areas. For example, at the Thames, at the Humber, etc. Those are also captured within this. It's not just the seaside coast. But when you take it as a whole and you do the analysis that Tom showed about putting things into communities into income quintiles, I mean, it really does bring home the fact that there is a marked skew, particularly in the English income distribution towards lower income communities around the coast. So that was sort of, and then looking at the maps and seeing the red ring almost around the UK, it sort of brings home what I think some of us instinctively thought. I think then it sort of prompts the extent of the issue. So this is a UK-wide issue, as Tom showed. There are red dots all around the coast of the southeast of the UK, somewhere which we typically think of as being relatively rich, as well as the areas that you might more instinctively gravitate towards, such as the northeast. And I think the important bit of differentiation between rural towns, cities, etc., is an important thing that sort of maybe was knocking around in the back of people's heads, but also came out. I think but probably what's most exciting is that just spending a day looking at this, only a day, you start to realize new things about it and new challenges, but also some new opportunities. And I just highlight two of those things. The first thing is this point about the halo effect. So the actual communities closest to the ports themselves tend to be the poorest, whereas there's higher income around them. That's particularly important for ports because they typically generate or gather a very substantial amount of their workforce from very close to the port itself. So that's something that we really want to be involved in. And the last point is the comparison with France, which is not something I'd seen in Deep Belgium. It's not something I'd seen before in terms of international comparison. And for me, what that says is there's nothing inherently poor about the coast, right? It doesn't have to be like this. There's some really interesting questions, I think, to be asked about, why it's different in the UK than it is in France. But then there's an even more interesting set of questions to ask about what we do about it. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Paul, who has hopefully been keeping an eye on some of the chat to see if there are sort of questions, points, etc., that people want to bring up. Over to you, Paul.
So thanks, Tim. That was great. And thanks, Tom. The Tim and Tom show. So as someone who grew up in Scarborough, I am very, very interested in all this. So, Tom, it will not surprise you to have some questions around how did we decide on 10 kilometres as being coastal? So if you just share about how we got to that, but also I think it's a really good story about how being open really helped us in this.
Yeah. We picked 10 kilometres over, let's say, 10 miles because the best projections in the default software make it easier to work in kilometres. A lot of other places have picked 10 kilometres also through not much of a reason. We tried 5, we tried 8, we tried 15, and 10 looks about the best. But I think there's a really interesting discussion to have about what number we want that to be. There's some real problems with our data in the Highlands of Scotland, for example. So where you have like deep locks or inlets into a country or an area, 10 kilometres is probably too much. You might want that to be smaller. But for Ireland, 10 kilometres works really well. So since we did all of our prototyping for Ireland and Northern Ireland, 10 kilometres stuck. But as I say, it's in the code. You could change it in 10 seconds and you could recalculate everything that I've calculated here. We could change to be 5 kilometres being a coastal area and it would take 1 hour.
Fantastic. And also we got help. We got a lot of help early on about how we define coasts.
Oh yeah.
Friends. Yeah.
Yeah, I asked on the internet, how would you define a coast? And about 200 people told me very confidently how we would define a coast. And eventually we got to something which was largely agreed upon. So it was really, really good, actually, the way that we found these open data sets. So sadly, there are a lot of the data sets around coasts are not quite open, so we couldn't use them for this project. It's something that we've let the publishers of that data know, but there are some restrictions on the data which probably were put in there by a lawyer without thinking why it would stop us from doing the work we're doing. Thankfully, we were able to find open data sets to define all of the world's coasts pretty easily in the end.
Fantastic. So we've got quite a few questions around, I guess there's a comparison between the UK and France.
Yeah.
And also, how do people define themselves as coastal and whether they would be defined as coastal and whether they see themselves as. So I think there's a really good question here about what jobs do the people on the coast in France do that they don't do in the UK, or do we know that, or are we guessing?
So the the sociological aspects of a coastal community versus actually living on the coast, I think is really just super important. I mean, you always get the examples of it. You know, a lot of people who live in Liverpool wouldn't say they were coastal. They live in the big city of Liverpool. And then when you remind them that, well, you define your city by its port and it's the Mersey, which is a lot bigger than a river, then you'll definitely have a different view of what that place is compared to, let's say, Blackpool, or let's say a small Cornish fishing village. The jobs that are making the French coast prosperous are not coastally attached jobs. That we can know. There is no great bounty from fishing that happens along the Brittany coast that does not happen along the coast of Cornwall. Like in both countries, the fishing community is really struggling, has been for quite a while. It's simply that people are choosing to live in these coastal communities, and many of them will be doing kind of jobs that we could do if we wanted. We've chosen to live inland, most of us. The French like to see the sea in the morning, it seems. I don't know whether they like eating fresher crabs or something like that as well. I don't know. But we haven't looked at that. I'd love to look at it in more detail to understand why that is. There is a little bit of an effect of tourism. I think that's slightly exaggerated, though. So many of the French areas which benefit from tourism are extremely poor. So down at the furthest south of France, Perpignan has a lot of tourism. Corsica has a lot of tourism. It doesn't make it prosperous. Normandy doesn't have a huge amount of tourism, very prosperous. People are working in all kinds of industries and just choosing to live on the coast.
Thanks, Tom. There's two bits of sort of the questions that are coming up. One is, do we have other data sets which we'd like to show? And then also, I think there's more one for Tim, which is, people are thinking about, there's lots of questions in the chat about what do we do next with this data? How do we use to make decisions? What is affecting your investment? And dare I say it, what about Brexit? So, Tom, if you can pick about this, if you can talk about other data sets, and then Tim, unfortunately, we're going to have to talk about it.
So, we have spent probably 80% of our time on this project dealing with the pain of learning all about different projections. I mean, one of the most painful parts of this is that each country provides its data in different projections, which I didn't even really think about. I just thought you just slam it on a map and it'll work, but maps don't work like that, I've now learned. So a lot of the work we've done has been sticking together the fact that every different country is publishing data in different ways, different projections. With the income, we've managed to join together 7 different data sets. For population, we've managed to join together 7 different data sets and get a really consistent outcome. I'm really confident that with the tools we've built, we can quickly add the other data sets. But what's probably proven a little bit harder is that we need to know where the data sets are. So I could calculate now for England and Wales, using the census data and what's on the ONS, I could calculate 100 different measures of deprivation or educational achievement or access to labour markets or public transport access time. We could do all that, and we probably will do all that, and the tools are all there that make it really easy. What I'd like is to know, how can I do exactly the same for the Republic of Ireland? And I don't know where the data sets are. And I don't know where the data sets are always for Northern Ireland. I don't know where they are for Scotland. I don't know where they are for France or Belgium. So the challenge now is that with this technique, which we can project any data that we like onto the coast and do analysis of coastal versus non-coastal, without looking at just coastal towns, without looking at seaside communities, we can look at the whole of the coast of different types. The challenge now is to get all of the data together and just push it through this tool, and that the work's already done. So that's my hope going forward, is that we look more at, and I think we know about quite a bit about educational attainment being poorer in coastal communities in England. That's, is that the same in Scotland? I've no idea. I just don't know. But once we get the data, which I'm sure exists, and we push it through, we can answer that question. And the dream then would be to say we can take the whole UK view, but also compare ourselves with our neighbours and have a full view of the coast.
Thanks, Tom. And then just there's a couple of questions about other data sets, such as climate change data sets, environmental data sets. We can plug all these together, and I think there's a plea from us is that if people understand those data sets and understand the context, we'd love you to join and share and join in with us to take what we've done and maybe take it another step, or maybe suggest data sets that we could look at in another step of this project.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important to say that. As I say, Martin Lambrecht's just sent us the Belgian data, and he said, there you go, put Belgium in. And I said, this is brilliant, thank you. The population data, that was someone at Eurostat just got in touch and said, look, you can do this for the whole of Europe. We've already stuck it together. It was loads of work. Please reuse it for coastal. It's great. I'm absolutely certain that other people have all of the ideas and the data, and we're happy to do the work of processing it in our tools because we've already written them, or they can just take our tools and do it themselves. That would be brilliant as well.
Thanks. Tim.
Yeah.
Looking forward, looking at the economies and maybe some donuts around economies and improvements, or if we want to be a bit more French. What do you think is going to happen next?
Okay, so first of all, I was going to make a reflection on this project and the points that Tom has been making about data, right? Because I'm a data numpty, right? Yeah, the spreadsheets are about as close as I get to any kind of serious data. So for me, it was something of an alarming moment in the first sort of 4 weeks of this project, where we kicked off and everyone's very enthusiastic, whatever, and we say, well, right, we'll have a catch up in a month's time. So we arrive on a Zoom call in a month's time, and I'm expecting to see graphs and whatever things like we've ended up with. And Tom says, actually, we spent the last 4 weeks having some really interesting conversations about what is the coast, right? And it's been a fascinating experience for me, just to see how difficult some of these apparently very straightforward things are to do, and it's been a real exercise in the gap between data and information, right? And the massive amount of work that one has to put into converting one to the other. So it's been a real education for me in that, and the hard work that Tom and the team have done hopefully now is a useful resource for anybody who wants to do it. And I think I'd also build on the point, Tom, that you made, and also Paul, that you made, that this is tonight's conversation is a stepping stone, or it's not a starting point, but it's a stepping stone on a journey we need to be in. Part of that is data, which is how do we add more data, how do we expand and improve the analysis, the picture, etc. But also I think we need to use the data as a tool, and the tool is about informing what the policy solutions are. How do we improve job creation, prosperity, well-being, etc. in some of these coastal communities? Because the actual data picture itself, even on some of the things we've already seen, is pretty clear, pretty stark, I would suggest. What does that mean for us as ports? I think it's Tom's reflection that what helps the French coast is that there are more jobs that are not necessarily coastal jobs. Is an important thing for ports to think about. It's something we're driving towards anyway. Using the port as more than just a coastal gateway. It's about what the port can be as a centre for economic activity in its own right. So behind me on the picture of Belfast, although you can't quite see it, there's, for example, a film studio where they used to store grain and coal, etc. So how do we develop our estates, but also how do policymakers help us do that in a wider way, so we can bring some of those, not just jobs, but also, and not just traditional port jobs, but also non-port jobs to coastal communities. And I thought I'd talk long enough that I wouldn't have to talk about Brexit, but I've sort of run out of time now. So on Brexit, I mean, the future is inherently unknowable, even more so perhaps now than it's been for a while. I think the two things that I would venture, which is that whatever short-term disruption we see will resolve itself over time. Not just the ports, but the logistics sector is it's a pretty resourceful sector. So there is likely to be some disruption. It will sort of work itself out, but not necessarily in a sort of back to normal kind of way. And here I think COVID has an influence too. So the future we're looking at in ports is different than it was 12, 14, 18 months ago. Resilience is a much higher factor upon people's decision making. What that means is things like we probably see a little bit more diversity about the movement of freight to and from Europe, which should help coastal communities outside of the southeast also, perhaps in new areas. But also, people thinking, businesses thinking through what resilient supply chains mean for them. That might have more opportunities, or should have more opportunities for ports, which again should contribute towards this picture of more job creation, investment, and prosperity as well. So there are definitely challenges and uncertainties, but hopefully there's some upside and opportunity for ports as well.
Okay, so thanks very much, Tim. There's some really good questions coming in the chat, and it's mainly about, could you help us answer another question? And as always, we always start with, okay, could you help us find some data first? But you could imagine this tool now could be applied to lots of different contexts. Is it economy? Is it environment? Is it about economic changes, ethnographic? So, or lots of different ways. And the reason we share this openly is we want to be building infrastructure and data infrastructure for others to join in with and share. And then if there's interesting questions, we can maybe help, or people can take that and remix it and bring it back to us. Absolutely, please do join in. But you'll notice in the chat that I've been letting people know that if you can help us find the data first, that's a massive help in what we do. So that's enough from me. I think that's enough from Tom. We're nearly out of time. And then for Tim, just if you could let us know what might be happening next in terms of the project and what we do with data and in terms of the Major Ports Group. There was a question there was a specific question around how the knowledge from 50 coastal partnerships could be utilized to shed light on trends in their data. So I've suggested that if we are all more open and share, that makes it easier to collaborate. But maybe you want to pick up on the question about 50 coastal partnerships and then say goodbye and thanks for all the fish.
Okay, was that a deliberate coastal joke there, Paul? Well done. So I think in terms of the coastal partnerships point, I think that's a fascinating point. It's a really good actually prompt for me to do more engagement with the Coastal Partnership Network, which is a network of groups all across the UK looking at a range of different dimensions of the coast. And I think that kind of local qualitative insight combined with the data, I think should be a really powerful combination to drive insight and hopefully some solutions out of that. So in terms of what happens next, I guess I sort of see this as a three-part process. The first of which is tonight is probably the end of phase one, which is Tom and Paul and all the people in the ODI Leeds have gone through the pain of actually creating this very flexible open data tool, which is the questions coming in demonstrate can be applied in a number of different ways. So we've gone through that phase, that sort of construction phase. We're now sort of in that, can it be improved? Can it be extended? Can other data sets be put through it? And I think that you've heard the answer to that is yes, but bring us the data. But then there's also the bit that starts to say, okay, what does it mean, right? So as well as, you know, what's the data aspect of it, we are very keen to hear what people think it actually means, what it says, what its conclusions are, or you know, what the pointers are from this in it. Because, you know, me and Tom have looked at it, and, you know, we have our own views, but what are yours as well? And, you know, for example, the conversation with the coastal partnerships could be a really important part of that. So that's sort of phase 2. So that's sort of like interpret, extend, develop. But then there's a third bit that says, okay, you know, we've built a really useful data-driven picture of what's happening. Hopefully, we've informed that with some, you know, some real knowledge and insight from, you know, people closer to what happens, whether they be coastal partnership or businesses or something. But then really, you know, a conversation which is around sort of, you know, policy, maybe a bit of regulation about actually how are we going to, you know, address some of these very real problems of deprivation all around the coast of the UK. So tonight's the end of phase 1. We need to think about phase 2 and phase 3. But, you know, it's an ongoing conversation, and, you know I speak for the ODI people, say we look forward to all your input into that. And I guess it probably just leaves me to say, you know, two separate thank yous. One of which is to Paul and Tom and all the people you haven't seen on screen tonight at the ODI Leeds, who've worked incredibly hard to build this tool and gather this data and get us to where we are now, but also have worked really hard to put on this this virtual event across a number of different locations. So a big thank you to them. But also finally, a big thank you to you for dialing in tonight. We hope you found it useful, interesting. We really hope you get involved, you have a look at the tool, have a play with it, find out what it means, etc. And we really hope that you engage, you know, in both the data conversation, but also the sort of policy and solutions discussion as we go forward as well. So get in touch with ODIL, get in touch with me and the UK Major Ports Group, and let's let's work a bit more on this. So with that, I think Paul and Tom, I think I'm going to say good night.